everyone. So this is the first conversation on social issues of the quarter, and we have a full lineup for the quarter all the way through the end of February and probably the first week of March. We're having these every Thursday at noon. And I want to say just a little bit about why the library sponsors these conversations on social issues. And it's because we think of the library as a place for the exchange of all different kinds of information and ideas. And we have all kinds of books and on our shelves, all kinds of information available through our databases, and having actual conversations with each other and bringing in people who know something, who can share something with us on a topic, is another way of continuing conversations. And we also recognize that some topics are going to be actually kind of controversial. Not everyone's going to agree, but we agree to share our differences respectfully and learn a little bit of something. Today we have Claudia Rowe, who is going to talk about journalism and some changes happening in the news arena. Claudia has experience as a journalist with the New York Times, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and she also works for Seattle Central Community College in our Public Information Office, so we're really happy to have you here. I also want to say that this particular talk is sponsored by Humanities Washington. So Claudia's a part of the Speakers Bureau that takes talks like this to different parts of the community. So we're happy that we were able to have her here in that capacity. So thanks very much.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm just going to launch in. I also want to say these talks are designed really to be conversations. They're supposed to be give and take and questions and arguments and whatever. So if you feel a burning need to jump in with a question, do so. If you want to ask at the end, hopefully there will be some time at the end. Okay, so when I was at college, 1987 and 88, newspaper circulations in this country were at an all-time high. It's only 26 years later, and today the job of newspaper reporter is rated as the 5th worst of 200 possible occupations. So being a maid ranks higher, being a janitor, driving a cab, washing dishes, all better jobs. Being a reporter is only a little less crappy than being an oil rig worker, apparently. So you can see we're 196 reporters. I guess dairy farmers have it worse, but you know, pretty much anybody else is better. So the reasons for this are pretty obvious. High stress of the job, low pay, and now almost no career stability. And that's really the focus of this talk. In the past 4 years, more than 100 newspapers across this country have folded. My own former employer, the Seattle PI, was one of them in 2009. Thousands of journalists have filed for unemployment. And nationwide, newsroom staffing is at its lowest point since 1978. In Washington, there is no question that all media, that's radio, television, newspapers, magazines, have fewer reporters covering less area than at any time in the past 100 years. Does that sound okay to you? Because I actually think that readers and viewers and listeners have a role, a very distinct role in shaping where we go from here. We're kind of at a nadir, hopefully. So what happened? Why this plummet? Two things, in my opinion. A certain amount of arrogance and complacency, mainly, within the industry, within journalism and the practitioners of journalism. It was a failure to sort of see the writing on the wall, to hear what was coming, and to hear readers. There's this doctor sort of anointed by Oprah, Andrew Weil. He has a bald head and a big beard. He says that he completely avoids media, doesn't read or listen to anything as a way to maintain his overall well-being, overall sense of health. And I've heard this from other people too, who think that absorbing the constant blather from radio and television and newspapers is actually physically damaging. And actually, I can kind of understand that, because I spent 20 years writing about poverty and crime, trying to illuminate some of the sadder, subtler stories behind the acts of teenage gangbangers and juvenile prostitutes and lonely serial killers. These are the people who often make up those blaring headlines. So I actually think that Dr. Weil might be onto something, because for all our pretense in being there to serve the public good, the news industry does traffic in fear. It promises, there's an implicit promise that if you listen, you'll hear about some potentially fatal disease, or some vote that might wipe out your health care, some criminal on the loose. And the industry kind of depends on stoking that fear to keep you hooked in, listening and reading more, hoping for that sort of that nugget of knowledge, that magic kernel that you feel is going to keep you safe if you know. I don't think that that's entirely a bad thing. I just think it's really important to keep it in mind while you're listening and reading. Because the point is that traditional news organizations, we're talking about regular, mainstream, for-profit news, not public media. Traditional news organizations are businesses. They are businesses first. They are selling a product. And while it's great when that product contributes to social good, if we run a piece on Angelina Jolie's legs or the cutest puppy born this year and it gets more readers, we're going to go with that, telling ourselves that we really can't serve these loftier goals if our paper goes under. That's sort of where the industry is at right now. And I know this, it's not just my speculation. I know this because a former editor of mine at the Seattle PI sat there and explicitly said this to me just this summer. This is a guy who I respect a lot. This is a smart, experienced news person. And he told me straight up that SeattlePI.com, which is the online-only news site left over after we were all laid off. Almost everybody at the paper was laid off, and this online site remained. This editor of mine said, yeah, we're not going to run any stories about Robert Bales. That's the soldier in Afghanistan who snapped one night and ran around shooting and killing 16 women and children for no reason. He now faces the death penalty. SeattlePI.com decided they wouldn't run a single story about Bales because readers don't click on the war. The war is just depressing. The war is a boring story. We don't click on it, so they're not going to run it. Apparently, we also don't click on stories about city council votes or the governor's race or anything that might have a really, truly significant impact on our lives. So I'm really not here to judge anybody's reading habits. I don't care about that at all. I just want to point out that to proceed this way sets up a very slippery slope. So I should show you some of these newspaper closures here. They're increasing. They're even more. And then, bam, all the layoffs and buyouts of 2009, which the Seattle PI was part of. It's a lot. That's 15,000 jobs, and I think that's an undercount, a fairly significant undercount. So here's an example of why it matters. In the mid-1990s, before any of this was a factor, before the internet was driving change, the small paper where I worked in New York State was already beginning to make coverage decisions based largely on financial considerations. The paper was owned by Gannett, which was at the time, and may still be, the most profitable newspaper chain in the country. And a series of women began disappearing from downtown Poughkeepsie. This was the city that we mostly covered. And there they are. The first one vanished far left there, Wendy Myers, vanished in July of 1996, and the second and third in August of that year. The Poughkeepsie Journal didn't run a single story, 0 words. This is a very small town of 23,000 people where everyone is connected. The very small city is in the middle of this wealthy county. It is heavily invested in tourism. It is a place where the Roosevelts and the Vanderbilts built their family estates. So while Poughkeepsie, the city of Poughkeepsie itself, had some very obvious social problems, high poverty and poor schools and a ridiculous dropout rate, it existed surrounded by this very wealthy county where there were, as I say, these estates, and where a lot of movie stars lived. James Earl Jones, Liam Neeson, Mary Tyler Moore, they all lived there when they weren't in Hollywood. So I had worked for this paper for 2 years as an education reporter. And I quit very shortly before these disappearances to start writing for the New York Times. But my boyfriend was still in the newsroom, and he would come back complaining every night about how everybody knew these women missing, and more and more and more, and the paper did not write one word. So by the fall of 1996, 4 women were gone, the top 4 across the top. The journal existed with almost no competition. It covered the entire county and most of the neighboring county as well, a very large area. And that is a situation similar to what you see today, where more and more newspapers are closing, so you have fewer and fewer media outlets deciding what gets put out there. There's less and less competition. Well, by this point, the police had a pretty good idea that there was a really serious pattern afoot and the distinct possibility of a serial killer at work. But for the journal to publicize this would mean publicizing a lot of other things too. It would mean admitting that Poughkeepsie was awash in drugs and prostitution. It would mean publicizing the fact that Dutchess County, New York, this larger area, was not only a community of farmers markets and equestrians. It had serious social problems that had been allowed to fester for years. It would mean writing about these people who probably tourists would not be interested in reading about. It would mean running stories that might make city officials and county officials look not so great. So the bottom line is these women were throwaways, right? They are not voting in most elections. They're certainly not spending a lot of money at the malls. A detective on the case flatly admitted to me, straight up, that if they had been, students at one of the area colleges, like Vassar, which was right there, the entire investigation would have been handled differently. He just said it right out to me. So after 6 women were gone, our top 4, these 2 on the left there, the journal did run one tiny short piece, but there were no follow-ups, and the disappearances continued. For 2 years, this went on, until 8 women, possibly more, were gone. And then in September of 1998, this guy, Kendall Francois, confessed. And when police came to his house to look for the bodies, all of which he had told them were in his attic and his basement, they went into his bedroom and they found a copy of the Poughkeepsie Journal face up on his bed, showing the front page story from that day about the formation of a missing women task force. It was a photo op story. It was a created event. I'm not saying that this late in the day news coverage directly prompted Kendall Francois' confession. He spent 5 years corresponding with this guy. So I know that it was a confluence of much more complicated factors, including that. I do believe that more coverage earlier would have intensified pressure on the police, which might very well have resulted in fewer deaths, because the pattern is just sort of inescapable. These women are missing, the newspaper ignores it, the disappearances continue. Then, 2 years later, women's families begin to start to complain. Pressure slowly mounts to the point where the FBI shows up, and the next week, this guy turns himself in. You can't really ignore that. So it is my opinion that more public pressure, which could, or maybe should, have come from the newspaper, at least some of these women would not be dead today. These last couple on the bottom, she was a mother of 5 children, this blonde here. The one next to her was waiting for her first grandchild. There were cops who told me, yeah, at least the last 3, we knew we had it, but nobody cared. Nobody cared, and there was no pressure from the local paper, which is, the organ you depend on to tell you these things. I do believe that local journalism failed so dismally in this case that 8 women lost their lives, in part because their home community didn't know anything about their disappearance. So now, think about this story, and then think about the question that bothers me every single day. What is our role as journalists? Are we supposed to provide the news that you want to hear, like nice restaurants and movie reviews, or the news that you need to know? So the answer to that used to be a given. When I started in the business, everybody knew we were there to sort of ferret out the bad guys and promote this civic unity. But that given is today being reevaluated at potentially ruinous cost. So you guys probably have heard a little bit about this massive sea change underway, but just so you understand the scope of what I'm talking about, you should know that in 2008, newspapers, just newspapers, not radio, magazines, television, just newspapers across the country cut advertising, well, they lost $7.5 billion in advertising. And they cut their spending on journalism by $1.6 billion in every year subsequent to that. That's $1.6 billion less reporters, editors, people whose job is to ferret out information who might go, weeks or even months without producing a story, but when they do, it's a huge story. Gone, gone, gone. So a statewide report that came out this summer from Washington State University found that here in Washington, more and more citizens are relying on smaller and smaller press corps, and that vast sections of this state have 0 journalistic boots on the ground, nothing. So we have Microsoft, and Amazon, and this huge Google satellite office. We have only 23 towns, 23, with a daily newspaper or radio station offering some kind of local news. So in huge sections of this state, citizens have no access at all to what's happening in their home communities. And I'll tell you that it's not just tiny little rural outposts. When the Seattle PI was circling the drain in the years before it just went down altogether, we reporters were told not to cover anything outside of city limits. So nothing in Renton, Kent, Bellevue, these huge population centers with important stories. You forget about the reservations, This was an effort to cut costs, to save on mileage, and to concentrate our reporting energies in the city, where it was more about efficiency. So that makes sense, efficiency. But at that time, I had just published a long piece, a sort of investigative piece, about a series of teen suicides that had taken place in a little cluster in a very short period of time on Mercer Island and in Bellevue. And this piece was very successful, apparently, and it galvanized a lot of talks between counselors and parents and kids. What I heard was that these kind of discussions were much overdue, much needed. And the managers at the PI loved the story, and they said, that's great, but you can't go outside city limits anymore. We're just not going to do it. So now, it's 5 years later, and we're described as a digital state, but an information ghetto. Okay, so I wouldn't wouldn't be that surprised if some of you thought, whatever, why should that concern me? I'm not gonna worry about a bunch of unemployed reporters, I got my own problems, I understand that. And I do believe that workers have to reinvent themselves, and all industries go through change. But here is why this really matters. Because the business is clearly proceeding now as really a business only, decisions are made all the time about what's financially worth covering or not. And the criteria used to determine the answer to that question is clicks, right? So a piece gets a lot of clicks, it goes on the website. If it doesn't, you won't see it. So the pieces that get the biggest clicks are photo galleries, like red carpet for the Academy Awards. That stuff is a gold mine to news sites. It costs very little to put it up there. Click, click, click from viewers, and it looks really good to advertisers. So this is the simple equation. It used to be that city council and school boards in every community had a reporter assigned, same with every state legislature. That's over. In Olympia, the press corps has been cut by 80%. That's almost wiped out in the last decade. And that is because readers, that is you and me, we have voted with our keyboards. And apparently we don't want to know what our elected representatives are doing. So I do understand that it's hard to care about this. You have a million other things competing for your time and your attention. You are worried about your own employment, or paying the rent, or can you take a vacation? Will you have health insurance? I understand. But to just look away and ignore what is happening is to say that you're okay with allowing powerful forces, powerful industries, powerful people to just do what they want unchecked because they know that there are fewer eyes watching. If you, the readers, we all, the readers, the viewers, the listeners, say by our actions that this is okay, that's really the message that's conveyed. Nobody cares, nobody's watching, do what you want. So the most recent extreme example of this is New Orleans, Louisiana. They are the most recent major city to lose a daily newspaper. So that means that metropolis with chronically high rates of corruption and dysfunction has no daily. Because in June, the owners of the paper, that's Advance Publications, decided to cut back to just printing 3 days a week. They laid off hundreds of reporters. This is happening in the place where several police officers were very recently exposed as having criminally assaulted minority residents in the chaotic days after Katrina. Those officers were found, their actions brought to light, they have been sentenced to prison, but that came from a newspaper. Without a newspaper watching, would it ever have come to light? And with a paper publishing just 3 days a week, will some editor decide that this tiny, ugly little item, we don't have room for it? It's too much work to run it down, to verify. These are conversations that take place every day. And it's not because anybody's a bad guy, it's because the pressures, the financial pressures are driving these kinds of decisions. But these tiny little items that take time to run down are how most massive news stories, like Watergate, for instance, that's how they start. And Cleveland is the next city up. Cleveland is owned by Advance Publications, the same publication that owns the New Orleans paper. And Cleveland is looking at the same kind of cutbacks that are probably imminent. So we're in this vicious cycle now where there are fewer and fewer news outlets to cover anything, and those that remain are scrambling to try to secure a healthy bottom line, believing that the way to do that is to continue to pump out news that's cheap to produce, like celebrity gossip or crime stats, breaking news. This is the stuff that you don't take months to do, that you don't dig into. It's often prepackaged and sold to the paper, particularly in celebrity gossip and fashion. There is really a new generation of reporters armed with awesome high-tech gadgets. So there are eager, energetic young reporters out there who are able to document and report the news faster, often better than ever before. But they have less time to sort of go beneath the surface. So they can show what they're seeing, they can show the landscape, but they have no time to sort of look under the rocks, look into the shadows, see the stuff that's concealed. It's just all right, what's right out there that you can get instantly. There's no time to dig. And just to ensure that you understand, this isn't me whining about losing my job. I loved my job, but this is much bigger than that. I will tell you, with the federal government, which is certainly, no fan of aggressive media, federal government, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, reports, they write that layoffs gutting the newsrooms have resulted in scandals not exposed, government waste not discovered, health dangers not identified in time, and local elections involving candidates about whom we know very, very little. That's the government saying that. They're the people that we attack, and they're even saying, yeah, this is a bad thing. So think about Kendall Francois, our killer back in Poughkeepsie, and those victims who nobody ever knew about until it was way past too late. And then ask yourself, are you okay with where we're going here, where this is all headed? Because in this new media landscape, there are some great things. Any and all perspectives have an easy avenue to reaching readers and listeners. Not as great. You can get your story out. Anybody can make their voice heard. But when anybody can put their views online, no matter how extreme or no matter what they are, it's sort of incumbent on you, the listener, the reader, the viewer, to be more active as you are absorbing that news, to be thinking while you're doing it. When a movement, for instance, like Occupy Wall Street, can sort of step away from the mass media and they created their own newspaper, put out their impressions about what they were doing and what was happening and what it meant. That's great. Anybody can get access to that online, but you just have to understand who's putting it out there. They're Occupy Wall Street. They have an agenda. You need to address your filters when you're hearing that. Think about who's putting this news out there, what is their interest. It doesn't mean anyone's necessarily bad, it just means you have to be thinking while you're getting the information. So here is an example of that. This local boy, Mike Daisey. He is a Seattle actor who got very famous creating sort of humorous monologues that took on large social questions. And Daisey, pretty recently, decided that he was as much a journalist as anyone else, and in the current climate, that is true. He had a name, and he had followers, and he had some access to the people whose stories he wanted to tell. So the story he wanted to tell was about Apple, and what went into the Apple products like iPads and iPhones that he loved and he used every day. So Daisey went to China, purportedly to interview workers at the Apple factories. And his findings, that Apple was employing kids as young as 10 years old and exposing workers to these hideously toxic chemicals. Those findings were reported on the very popular Serious News program on NPR, This American Life. It created a huge stir, a lot of buzz, a lot of outrage. But it turned out that all of Daisey's reporting, which was now stamped with this respectable imprimatur of NPR, all of that reporting was false. Daisey had not verified the ages of the young people that he interviewed, nor really much of anything else in the story. And producers had raised questions, producers at the radio station. They saw this story, they had questions, but nobody took the time to run down the answers before airing the program. Because they believed Daisey, because he was funny, and they liked him, and he was famous and bright, he seemed cool. It looked great, and it was a great story, but theirs was, NPR's, was this very, very common failing in news, to get the best story fastest. I hear all the time from readers and listeners and viewers that they don't care, except in breaking news, a crime situation, the Newtown shootings. Yes, in breaking news, who has it first does matter. But on a deeper thing, a profile of a person or investigation into a corporation, readers and viewers don't care who has it first. They want to know who has it best, the skill and precision and balance and subtlety with which that story is told. If NPR had waited 1 week to run down the answers to these questions, nobody else had this story. It wouldn't have mattered, but they didn't, because the pressure to be first, fast, best, even at NPR, which is public media, is not, the same kind of for-profit model I was discussing before. The pressure is there too. So when Daisy's Fabrications, were discovered by a real reporter, by the way, living in China, an NPR reporter living in China, he went back on this American life to explain himself. And it is excruciating to listen to. And any reporter who has ever made a mistake, you just cringe to listen to these stumbling kind of rationalizations, because Daisy's mistakes were not innocent mistakes. He acted out of hubris, an agenda, a belief that, these larger truths, in this case, the craven corporate evil of Apple, that these larger truths sort of justified sloughing over awkward things that didn't fit the picture. They justified manipulating facts and hiding that from editors. So it was a debacle for NPR, this respected agency. And it was, perhaps more importantly, a win for Apple, which might in fact be doing some pretty heinous things. But it's going to be that much harder now to find that out, and that much more difficult for anyone to believe really extreme claims when they're brought forward. We all get jaded. We don't believe anything, right? So what I'm saying here really is that journalism now is no longer a one-way street. It's no longer just the purview of reporters and editors who know better, which is sort of how we used to operate. But the fact is, as everybody knows now, we're just humans. Most of us have kind of middling educations. We're not policy experts generally, except for like Paul Krugman. So really, to work correctly, journalism, it needs public input. It requires your involvement. We love, as journalists, we love to claim impartiality, neutrality, dispassionate distance. We're not involved. But I think that often this becomes sort of a cover for laziness, sometimes for cowardice. There's this quote, "The hottest circles in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, preserve their neutrality." That's Dante. I put that up on my computer at the PI as a reminder, because after Poughkeepsie and what happened with Kendall Francois, I really felt that there are times when we shouldn't stand back and claim this, oh, we don't care, we're not involved, we have no opinion. There are times when we need to step forward. I thought that really was the whole point of a free press. It is true that traditionally journalists have been voyeurs, not participants, and it's not in the deep past. In 2008, I was working on a piece about gangs and gang violence, and the photographer I was working with shot an initiation. It's called a jumping in, at which a young man was ceremonially beaten. He wanted to be there. But I knew that readers would ask us, how could you just stand there and do nothing? Why didn't you, call the police? And I will admit to you that I was relieved to be able to tell them I had not actually witnessed this event. I knew that it was going to happen, or was supposed to be happening, but I left the scene beforehand. Not because of that. I actually regretted leaving, but I had another appointment. I couldn't hang around. So our photographer clicked away, and essentially I just ducked the question. But I think it bears some consideration. What really is our role here? Where do we draw the line? So for war photographers, this comes up all the time, also for photographers who cover natural disasters. When do you put down your camera and lend a hand? Should you just document every tragedy, even those that you could prevent? So every news person I've ever known clings to the purist's answer on that question. We are outsiders. We do not step in. We do not get involved. But you guys might feel very differently, because I'll tell you that I find huge disconnects between what the public believes about journalists and how we actually proceed, how we actually act. So I'm going to lay out the facts about that for you right here. Journalists, in my experience, are motivated really by just a few things. Curiosity, definitely, always. Ego, often. Sometimes idealism. Beyond that, it's all over the map. The standards for using unattributed, that's anonymous sources, have been different at every paper I ever worked at. There are sort of industry guidelines, but there's no oversight, nothing that makes you follow them. It's just sort of case by case, whatever. And despite what we all learned in school, and what you guys maybe learned, there really is no such thing as objectivity. There's fairness, not the same as objective. So journalists really rarely acknowledge this out loud, even now at this crisis moment. But it is possible for a human being to be truly objective. It's just not possible. We're making choices about what quotes to include, how to open a story, what note to leave as the final impression in a reader's mind. Those are choices. They're made by human beings who have their own backgrounds and histories and beliefs and prejudices. There are just really very few verifiable facts in any story, like this person filed for bankruptcy. But the reasons leading to that, the sort of human foibles that contributed to their failures, or the economic context in which this happened, all the things that led to the final fact, that's all supplied by the writer, or not supplied by the writer. And that writer is beholden, even unconsciously, to prejudices and opinions. We have been very reluctant to acknowledge this in the industry, and I think that that refusal is one of the reasons that we have lost the public's favor. Everybody knows it. We don't admit it. People say, well, you're just lying, you know. So while journalism has, in my opinion, earned much of the enmity that now threatens its existence, that's just not the end of the story. As with the failure to vote, you can't wash your hands of it without taking some of the blame for the results, right? So I want to just finish by underscoring this one point. While news today is almost entirely profit-driven, there lies within that scenario a real true avenue for action. What I want to emphasize is how you guys, the reading, listening, thinking public, have a role in where things go. Because in my experience, while editors might slam down the phone on a caller or delete an email, they actually do respond to community pressure. When people call and call demanding coverage of some event or vote or trend, you can believe me, an editor's going to assign someone. They have to, right? They see the writing on the wall. They understand that if people stop reading and listening in disgust or frustration, you know, their days of employment could be numbered. I don't know if that's a good thing, that we're so, you know, now so beholden to sort of public favor. But it is the fact, and it does provide an avenue for action if you want more substantive coverage. We have editors now that sort of rationalize this pretty crass, like kitties and titties approach to news judgment, and I did not make up that phrase, by the way. Comes from a very famous sports writer around here. But the reasoning goes like this, really. It's this kind of lazy or cowardice. I don't know. It's who are we to judge, right? If readers want this, who are we to judge what people want? It's not up to us to decide what people should care about. We serve the public, and if the public wants to know about bikini baristas, well, so be it. That's what you guys want. So the internet has made journalism a far more democratic endeavor, right? Anybody can get their story out, anybody can get to you. But it means that there's more responsibility than ever on the part of the viewer, the listener, the reader. So I'm asking you, as viewers and listeners and readers, to ask yourselves, really, what kind of information do you want? So that's it. Thanks very much for coming and for listening. And I'll take any questions if you have them.
Actually, I have a question. What was the whole view of WikiLeaks in your, when you heard about it?
Right, so when WikiLeaks happened, that was after, I believe, it was after the PI shut down. So I wasn't in a newsroom, I still write for newspapers, but I wasn't in a newsroom hearing like the constant buzz. I can tell you, just sort of based on anecdotal conversations with news folks, there's really a divide, I find, in the business. There was a kind of cohort of veterans, like, for instance, my editors at the New York Times, who are great and smart, and I loved working for them, but they are sort of the old guard. And they often view sort of firebrand agitation like that as threatening, right? And there is a sort of newer guard that goes with the, publish fast, put it all out there, just clean up the mess later. And I see that divide on the WikiLeaks story, that people who go, all information is good, any information, and it's up to us to kind of approach it with a discerning eye or ear, but just put it out there and let the reader make their own judgment. And then there's sort of the more traditional viewpoint, like we're the, more of an editor or manager position, we're the curators of news, and we decide what's valid or not. And I think that both sides have a point.
I think something interesting about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange is the first major leak was the helicopter shooting, and that I think broke on maybe the WikiLeaks site or went to YouTube or whatever. But the second major leak before the diplomatic cables, I can't remember what it was, but he actually gave the information to the New York Times,
Right.
and he said you have 10 days to curate it, basically. So he's recognizing that formal media outlets, like, he needs that kind of curation in order for this flood of information he's sending out to be effective and to have a message. And then, I think with the diplomatic cables, he gave priority to media outlets. But then there was some tiff between him and the media, and he decided that that wasn't going to be how he was going to do it. I'm not exactly sure.
I think there's a lot of, there's an issue here of control, right? Is he's saying, hey, New York Times, have this information, but you have 10 days. He's sort of taking the control away, what I would call it the fact-checking control, right? He's saying, you can have this hot information, but I'm going to limit your ability to really dig into it and trace it all the way back down to the root. You're not going to have any time.
But it is the root. It was all primary source information.
Right, but for the mainstream news organization to feel comfortable about the legitimacy of the information, you have to essentially, re-report everything he did, follow the whole trace back, and that takes time.
Yeah, I got a question. You talk about the local journalism. What I understand is the local is about things that happen surrounding your community, with everything concerned about your health, your life, or which because local, I think, it may affect you the decisions you make when you make some choices. I think it's too much. But you say those local journalism is diminishing, is disappearing. This is something that I was just very confused because I think my whole family, they are very concerned about this the things that happened in the local. And what I know for sure is there's no many local journalism in China, and what we do to get those local news is by the social networking.
Mhm.
For example, we are living in a community, and we can and everyone, even with neighbors, we have the social networking, and if this neighborhood having something and then it's online and we just get to know. But the problem is there's no a journalism. There's no
Right.
one who's
There's nobody
investigates.
checking.
Yeah, they just tell the story what happened, but
Which means that anybody who's got an agenda, anyone who's got a goal, can put a story out there on your network. If no one's checking it and everyone's believing it, and this person sort of has a point that they want to make, then you're buying into that if you're part of that and you believe anything that you read, and then you are led, you are manipulated.
yes, and actually we are very crave to hear some really the bad side of our society, like the crime or poverty or theft or some danger surrounding us. And but I just really wonder why this kind of local is washed out, as you say.
So
Which people are very love to hear this.
people love information, and there are sort of more information outlets than ever, right? There are all these blogs and news sites that cost very little to just put up. Anyone can do it and put their site out there. So it gives the impression, as you say, of more information out there. But it's just some guy or girl's sort of their line on it or their interviewer. There's just very little oversight, for one thing, over this sort of explosion of blogs and news sites. There's very little oversight, and then the other side of that is lots of these blogs and news sites you look and you'll see they're just recycling the same stories, which are sort of national level political maneuvering or disasters or crime, or they're just recycled stories. There's not really a whole lot of deep digging on a local blog in general. They're just not the resources to do that kind of digging. It takes real muscle to do that.
But you say there used to be a lot of local journalism covering, for example, our water system, how we get water and how this water are cleaned. So are these a part of the local journalism?
When you're saying there used to be a lot of it, you mean here in Seattle?
Oh, I was asking you because I just moved here. I don't know too much about here.
Right. So yes, I think the example that you're giving is an example of local journalism, but I don't know are you talking about China?
Oh, because I just moved to here, and back in China,
Right.
Back in China, we don't have any local journalism.
Right, you have
It's usually
government-controlled-
a big city,
right.
like a Seattle Times. We have this kind of level of paper.
Right, so in Seattle, for example, when there were, I think the Seattle Times is actually better than most, but when there were two papers here, when there was the Seattle Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, there was competition, right? So competition made each paper better, in my view, right? If one paper had a story, then the other paper, had to work harder to not get beat the next time, to have that story. So if you have that competition, you have somebody kind of nipping at your heels, keeping you honest, you have that urgency to be better. And if you don't have that, for instance, in the example I gave you from Poughkeepsie, if there is no competition, look, somebody else could have broken that story. It was no secret. Everybody knew. I mean, sort of everyone of power knew. But there was no competition. And I promise you, if some other daily had run that story, the Poughkeepsie Journal would have had to answer. They would have had to do their own, then there would have been this mounting pressure. But that didn't happen.
I guess I had two things. two questions. Well, one was a statement, the other was a question. We were talking about how agendas affect news, and I'm taking international relations, and I learned that ABC, NBC, and CBC is owned by corporations. And how do you? I guess that's where my first question comes in. How do you feel about corporate-owned news that affects news locally?
Right. So, so the PI was a corporate-owned newspaper. I guess it is still a corporate-owned news site. It's Hearst Corporation. So I've worked for corporate-owned, and I've worked for a little scrappy independents that were just a family business. My feeling is this: traditionally, sort of, 100 years ago in this country, newspapers and news organizations traditionally were family-owned businesses. So they were owned by, the richest family in town, whatever, but they were owned by families who had a stake in their communities. They lived in their communities, and they had stake in the functioning of these communities. As that began to ebb and families sold to corporations, right? Those corporations not in the community, they're in wherever, New York, whatever, in the case of Hearst, right? When I worked for Gannett, that's the Poughkeepsie paper, their headquarters is in DC, actually in Arlington, Virginia. So less and less of a personal stake in the functioning of that community, because you're no longer the family in town. And I do think that that has had an effect, in some cases, on the coverage of news. I'll tell you straight up, I've never, despite what everybody thinks, I've never, ever had an editor at any paper anywhere say, we're not going to run that story, you can't run that story because an advertiser is going to be pissed off. I've never had that kind of corporate stamp that people always assume is happening all the time. I've never felt quashed in that sense by corporate ownership. What I think the real effect is what I said previously, this sort of lack of investment in the community. You just, if you're not there and you don't really need to care about the minutia and the inner workings of daily voting, you're not gonna care. You're a corporation, you are about profits, and definitely the Academy Awards are gonna generate more profits than some boring school board meeting. But that school board meeting is gonna affect, these 500 families. The Academy Awards is not gonna affect any families.
Yeah.
Well, I only said that because you have things like Fox News.
Right,
You know.
so that's a different deal.
Right. And the second part to this was, what about smaller areas like Seattle Weekly that do their own kind of journalism?
So Seattle Weekly is corporate owned.
Yeah.
And you, of course, know that they've gotten all this hot water in the last couple of years by the ads that they run in the back.
Right.
So they are corporate owned, and they are running these ads despite, much outcry against them, because this is generating revenue. Seattle Weekly is in a great deal of trouble financially, as you may know. So the pressure.
They just sold.
Did they just?
I think I heard that Monday.
Oh, I didn't even. Wow.
But it's still gonna be operated here, but it's another company that does all.
So Village Voice Media is their owner, and they sold just that property? That's interesting.
But there's another big weekly independent conglomerate out of Austin. I think that
Yes,
owns
that's new, called New,
some food. I can't remember the name, but anyways.
New Times.
New Times.
Yes.
So they own the other stuff.
No, The Stranger?
Yeah.
Does New Times own The Stranger?
I don't think so.
No.
Is
The Stranger is not independent here. They are owned by a larger company, which is out of, I think, somewhere in the Midwest. I think like Minneapolis or Chicago. I don't know. It's not. Janet.
I was just thinking, I also used to work in Seattle PI. The one thing though, even though it's corporate owned though, as far as your editors and your publishers and your reporters are local, so they have a vested interest in what's happening in the community. And I worked for the PI for longer than Claudia did. The one thing I liked, frankly, having a corporation that was based in New York,
Right.
totally left us alone from a newsroom standpoint. When I first came to the PI as a young reporter, the paper endorsed John Anderson, a third-party candidate, and for president, which was quite radical. And New York didn't know it until one of our readers was upset, called headquarters and said, did you know what the PI did? And the corporate's response was, they have freedom to make editorial choices, we never tell them what we do, what they can do. So what of course any corporation does control is your budget. But even if you're family owned, there's a budget control. So somebody's gotta control your budget, regardless if it's someone in New York or Minneapolis or
But it's
sitting in
just the
Seattle.
question of the person controlling the budget and what their overriding interests are.
Yeah, a locally owned one may be willing to spend more money on resources because they're vested. On the other hand, I have friends who work at small locally owned papers that when the publisher goes to the Rotary meeting and sits by a big advertiser who doesn't want him to do a story, there's a certain pressure about how you put a spin, you know, and it depends on how hopefully that publisher's strong enough to say, hands off, I don't tell the newsroom how to cover the news. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm talking more small, like weeklies, not something like, you know, a more active daily that's locally, although there's not very many family-owned papers up. Even the Seattle Times is half owned by a big corporation, McClatchy. They're half owned by Blues, half owned by McClatchy. Can you think of any big paper that's still family-owned? I can't, because San Francisco sold, LA sold.
Yes, they are family
That's a family.
owned.
The New York Times.
Oh, yeah, New York Times. But
They're rather large.
That little old paper, but they still have stockholders, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, they
So-
certainly
so that-
do.
So you're not,
So they're not.
you're not really owned by just, you sit around with your family in the living room and decide how to do it. You've got, if you have to answer the stockholders, that's another whole can of worms you have to deal with. Washington Post is dealing with that, the New York Times is dealing with that.
So, right, so the issue about the financial model is one that, you know, you can just go forever talking about. My hope is more to sort of tell you guys, don't be passive. It's not like, you know, news now just presents this offering and you have no choice. You actually have, because people are so worked up about attracting viewers and keeping viewers, you know, or listener or reader, whatever, you actually have more power than you ever did.
I think the other thing I want to reiterate too is that you really have to look at who the source of your news is. When it's the New York Times, Washington Post, you assume there's some kind of a standard, but when you're just reading something online,
No, you
you
shouldn't.
don't know what the agenda of that person that wrote that is. So you really have to be much more critical when you read. You should be critical to everything, but especially if it's something from a source you don't know.
You have to be information literate.
Right.
And in fact, that's what the library does. So if you come into the library with your classes, with your class to learn something about research, we will often talk about some of these very issues. But this really gives some great context for the kind of evaluation that we have to do as we're doing research. And just by the way, as a little plug, we offer classes this quarter. We're just offering one credit class that is a research class focused on using the internet. So it's searching and also evaluating and using information. So there's that, and that's still open. It doesn't start till next week. It runs just 5 weeks. It's and do you want to say something about next week?
Yeah, next week, same time, same place. Carl Livingston, who is a political science instructor here at Seattle Central Community College, is going to talk about new directions in Black history. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope that you guys can join us again.
And two last little things. I really want to thank Claudia for coming for helping us have her here, and to let you know, I think that her message is really, really important and gave me a lot to think about. And we recorded this session, and it'll be on the library's YouTube channel, and we'll post a link on the library's Facebook page. So if you want to share this with your friends, you can let them know that it's available.
Wait, are we allowed to do that with your speakers here?
I assume so.
Okay.
I think so. You know, I'll just check. I'm sure you are. I will call those guys and check and let you know. But I'm sure that the more eyes, the better is my guess.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I passed out a quick evaluation form that Connecticut Washington asked for, and so if you can just leave them up front on your way out, I'd appreciate it.
can you help me know how to get my safely out of here? This thing is like tumbling.